From beaded gowns to battle-worn leather, costume design has long been one of cinema's most evocative storytelling tools. There's nothing like the visceral connection of a costume to connect us with our favorite characters and movie memories. Welcome to Classic Movie Club. I'm your host, Chad Knirk, the digital editor of Film Review. We've been celebrating cinema here at Film Review since 1944, and though times have changed in the last 80 years, clothes have always expressed our personality, our status, and reflected who we are and how we live. The clothing of a character is an important visual transmission of theme and story, an intrinsic part of the character's journey, and of the stories we've been swept away by. The collection of motion picture costume design is one of the world's largest and most meticulously curated private archives of film costumes, founded in 1989 by respected Hollywood costume historians, archivists, and consultants Larry McQueen and the late Bill Thomas. What began with a single shared acquisition of Greta Garbo's gown from Queen Christina has, over 35 years, grown into a 650-some piece collection spanning film history from 1916's Intolerance to 2015's The Danish Girl. McQueen's mission has always been about a reverence for that history and the often unsung designers and craftspeople who brought cinema's most memorable looks to the screen. In The Costumes of Hollywood, highlights from the collection of motion picture costume design, a new book available now from Routledge, readers are invited into the artistry, history, and work of preserving screen-worn fashion spanning a century. The text is a visual and narrative archive presenting full-page color photos of the garments themselves, many of which have never appeared in print, along with looks into interior construction, restoration, and their complex journey from screen to exhibition and storage. Joining McQueen on the journey through his collection is co-author Coleen Scott, a costume designer, historian, and educator. The two connected during a virtual Costume Society of America event in the thick of the pandemic. What began as a casual conversation about costumes quickly grew into a collaboration and commitment to preserving the story of the collection in print. Larry, how would you summarize the essence of the collection as a whole?
Oh gosh. I hope that what the collection is about is the dedication and everything that it took to acquire all of this stuff. And it happened over a period of many years. The purpose of the collection and what it was about changed as the years went by, and we started to realize that as we got more and more things and we realized what those things meant and we realized what those things could mean, the essence has certainly changed. But a long time ago, we sort of decided that we wanted not only to create a collection that had star names, because star names were important if you wanted anybody to ever show them. And we always intended that these things would be shared in exhibition. So we knew that was an important thing, but we also wanted to bring forward the talented people that created these things and designed things because there's so much thought process that goes in behind these things that is often ignored or not recognized by the public. And we wanted to sort of give those designers and craftspeople some credit for what they had done.
I do think that the role of the costume designer is central to what the essence is, grasping the essence of this collection. It's the costume designer and the costume designer's work and job. And that's why in this collection, there are some things that are really well known roles and really well known actors. And there are some things that are just amazing construction and design, and maybe a lesser known role, but a significant work of art that is that costume piece.
How did you approach your collaboration together and the visual journey of creating this text?
We hung out for a while before I gently talked Larry into making a book. It was mostly because I was really interested in what he had and was shocked by this collection that I hadn't heard of. And so I wanted to talk to him more because I'm a costume designer and it was really exciting. So that started it. And then approaching the book visually partially was about Larry's and Bill's ideas for how parts of the collection could be exhibited. So it's like their dream exhibitions. So that's how we started thinking about it visually, because chronologically it didn't seem interesting enough. It didn't quite make sense. It made more sense to group them into these exhibitions and then make those chronological. So visually, that's how we approached it.
I have to admit, I mean, when this whole thing started and she sort of suggested the idea of a book, I mean, we didn't know each other at all. I mean, we just started talking about costumes and stuff like that. The concept was a little bit scary. I mean, is this person actually going to show up and do the work that's needed? And I'm sure she felt the same thing about me. Was I going to come up with the information and the photos and everything that was needed for this book? And so that took a long time. But as we started to get to know one another, I mean, one thing I truly want to say about Coleen is that she is like fearless and she's confident. She lives a very big lifestyle. I mean, my gosh, she was a burlesque performer and she's a costume designer and she's a costume teacher for a college and she had done it. I mean, I came from Bible Belt, you know, Midwest in an environment where you weren't really supposed to have vanity or any sort of self-expression. You were supposed to just blend into the net woodwork and just be a good boy. But I did discover theater, and I think that was probably my way of escaping into another world that was sort of make believe, where you could be whatever you wanted to be, and you didn't have to follow the rules and regulations of society around you. And that's the thing that Colleen and I had in common, was that we were both theater nerds and discussing that. I think that's where a lot of the trust came in, and I truly am appreciative for her for convincing me that I did have a story to tell, that I should be proud of it.
This is one of my favorite topics to delve into and to talk about. And I think, Larry, you've done such an amazing job of cataloging all of the details behind the provenance and history of these pieces. Can you share with me a little bit about your process?
It was strange putting together a collection because you never know what's going to come up and you never know how the story. I mean, it's not that we started off with a very clear idea of what we wanted to collect and what it was going to look like and what it was going to mean. I mean, pieces would come up and it was like, okay, can we incorporate that into a story? Or that, and also because our whole purpose was to show the pieces at exhibitions, it was like, well, this could work in that category and this could work in that category. It kind of developed for the 5 years that Bill and I worked together, and then the remaining 30 years that I did it. I would like to say that there was a very big thought process behind it, but there wasn't, because I'd learned a long time ago that you can covet a piece and wish a piece would come up for sale, and it's like, I need that piece because that's going to be the star of this section or whatever. Those pieces may not even exist. And so what you're basically doing is wasting a lot of time on stuff that may not exist. So there was sort of an openness to what pieces come to you, what pieces you can afford to buy, because there isn't huge financial backing behind this. A lot of it is uh, picking the pieces that come available to you that you can afford and see how they fit into the storyline that you're trying to tell. And we didn't even know what the entire full storyline was going to be, but it was doing it as it came along. And I think by taking that sort of objective approach, sort of took some of the pressure of having to have it all away. I don't have to have everything. I don't have to tell the best story in the world or as good as a story as somebody else. All I have to do is tell my story. And that's what I hope we did. And as far as the pieces that came in and how they came in, I mean, most of them were purchased in auction or from private collectors. The ones that mean the most to me, one of our goals from the beginning was we wanted to create an air of respectability about being a collector, because it certainly was not respected in the early days. And that was one of our goals. And so in the later years, when someone would contact me, and they would contact me because they wanted me to have it, because they either knew I would spend the time and money to restore it if it needed restoring or conservation work done on it, or because they wanted it to go into a good home. And that was kind of a big kind of like win for me when I realized that I had, or I was starting to gain some respect for what I was trying to do.
Yeah. Now there's 650-ish pieces in the
Hmm.
collection. So I know initially when you're talking about putting the book together, you narrowed it down to maybe 300 or so. Um, how did you get down to that final however many are in the book, and what were a few that maybe didn't make the final cut?
It was all because of Colleen's magic pen that they disappeared. But
They slash and burn pen. Yeah.
I think there came a point when we were doing the book where I kind of realized, okay, it's not going to be an encyclopedic, you know,
Mm,
essay on everything that was in the collection. I mean, it just wasn't that type of book, and we didn't in the amount of pages, the amount of text we had, it was limited. So I mean, we spent a lot of time, and it was painful to go through those cuts and stuff like that, and Coleen, because she was so well versed on the structure of books and stuff like that, kind of knew how we had to structure it, and so that helped cut the things that were cut. And we both, it wasn't just me. I mean, she even resented having to cut things because
Mm-mm.
she had wanted it in the book so bad, but it just didn't fit.
Yeah, I think chapter 5 took the hardest cuts. The most came out of it. We would chapter 5 right now is heroes, heroines, and villains, I think. And just looking at an old spreadsheet, there's like 5 in there that left toward the end. And there's some bangers in there, like Super Mario Brothers, which we managed to get some photos into the book from it, but not an entry. But that was another thing about the formatting was okay, well, if we want to squeeze as many costumes as possible into this book, then really we're only going to get 1 page of text and 1 page where we're featuring the costume, since featuring the costume is the biggest goal. And we weren't wanting to do like, yeah, we're just going to do microscopic pictures of things on every page. The point was a full feature, because it's something that's special about the book is actual costume pictures, not just like a film still. Those ones are smaller in the book because it's, just proof that they were worn in a scene more than anything. So, I'm looking at this, and we
Hmm.
cut King Kong, right? We cut Jessica Lange. We
Hmm.
cut From Dusk Till Dawn, didn't we? Selma Hayek's not in there anymore, right? That was a hard one. That because it's an amazing costume. Anyway, they're all amazing. Jessica Lange's is a fully beaded gown. This is just the one chapter. And so what we were able to do in some cases um, was move certain things to chapter 6, which is the Inside Out chapter, to make room in some of the other chapters to include other period costumes or other musicals or other things. So some of that stuff got moved to 6 to balance it out. But when the production editor was, they were formatting it, they came to us and they were like, well, the editor says there's a blank page here. It's just a full blank page. Do you just want to put something there? And we had 2 of those opportunities, and that's when we squeezed in Super Mario and when we squeezed in Sunset Boulevard. Those were the 2 we squeezed
Yeah.
in at the end that had already been cut. But there's about 50 that we were like, well, we're going to try to do all these before we had to make the final cut. So it's only 6 chapters, so that means we were cutting like 8 and 10,
So I think it
during
got
each
to the point where
time.
eventually it was, I started to realize it isn't so much about the collection and the fully representing the collection. It was about the book and what was going to make the best readable, comprehensive, and entertaining book. And that's why we cut what we did.
And also a thorough selection so that it's representative of like early to more current film, and different style of film, so that there's as much variety shown as possible, because there's such a variety in this collection. So I think it representatively at least gives the reader a good idea of that.
Film costumes are are often different in design from real clothing. They're designed to look a certain way, perform a certain way. One great example is how weights were utilized in the Some Like It Hot dress. There's a pocket in the back, right, that helped that hang a certain way.
The Hollywood costumes that were done, especially perhaps more so in the vintage years when the studios had um, costume houses that did their own costumes, and they had, the top-notch designers and the top-notch, craftspeople who were being brought over from a lot of times from Europe because of the war situation, and so they got a lot of talent from that. So they had wonderful seamstresses, wonderful designers. They would make their own shoes, their own hats, everything within the studios. And at the time, the studios were a big money making thing. So they had an awful lot of money to pay for this sort of stuff. And because they wanted to treat the stars like their royalty, they spent a lot of money on these clothes. And there were a lot of different things, that sort of went into it. I mean, it was not only creating clothes that would put a character into a specific time and place or in a certain point in their life development that needed to come through in the costumes, but there were also experiments being done as far as because it was a new industry basically, and what would read well on the color, the film, and how it would read the textures, the colors, how they would come across, because in the beginning it was black and white. So they would do tests to see, well, what colors will photograph the best in black and white. And then when color came in, then they had a whole new problem of what colors photograph well, because in the processing, the colors change. So they had to make all of this up and learn all of this as they went along. So there was an awful lot that went into costume design, and it was like a lot of times Hollywood is criticized for not sticking to period when it comes with period film. I mean, and there were certainly some designers more than others that tried to adhere to the correct silhouette. But there was always an element of the time the film that was made because they wanted them to make them relatable to the people in the audiences, that it didn't look like something weird. There was something in there they were going to like, especially in there again in some of the more vintage costumes. All the a lot of the inner structure that made those pieces do what they do, as far as holding the body in or to making something flare out in a certain way. A lot of that was built onto the inside of the costume itself, which is somewhat more like a stage technique, which
Mm.
Coleen could probably talk about. But um, I mean, those things were designed to do exactly what they did in the film, because for a costume designer, the worst thing you can do is shut down a production because of a malfunctioning costume. It just costs too much money. And so you never wanted to do that. And so it was designed to perform perfectly every time. And there were a lot of tests and stuff that were done to make sure that piece did do that.
Thinking about creating, especially related to period costumes, yes, some inaccuracies, but also like they are shopping for fabrics and creating fabrics in the time the film was produced, not in like the
Mm.
1400s. So clearly there's going to be some discrepancies there. The color thing, it was a huge consideration. But as far as creating silhouettes, the difference between somebody in 1900 walking down the street during the day and somebody in a film, especially maybe a musical, is that the silhouette isn't necessarily created the same way. And like Larry was saying, understructures are built into the garment. That's a very theatrical practice, right? That's one thing. But also thinking about musicals and dancing, and
Mhm.
period pictures and movement, then there's a huge difference there in how those things are constructed because they're meant for big dance numbers. There wasn't stretch in a lot of these time periods, but there were things like that added into the costumes to make them more mobile for dance. That's a good example. And there were also a lot of the costume designers who are well known had a theater background. They're coming from theater, so even theater techniques of closures and like false closures where something looks like it's laced up, but it's not really, just for ease
Mm-hmm.
of movement or getting in and out of a costume. Some of those conventions are used too in some of these pieces.
How does the design and the designer's choices illuminate character, perhaps in some of the pieces in the collection?
That's the job of a costume designer. All of those considerations that you have to make as a designer about time and place and season and social status, economic
Mhm.
status, and relationship to the other characters, and what's your overall color palette and your concept for the screen picture or the stage picture, and how do those things fit together. Like, those are just some of the major considerations you have to make. So, all of that goes into capturing the essence of character. Um, Larry probably has a couple favorites that he purchased because of the character that was portrayed versus like, this is a nice Edith Head costume. I know
Mhm.
there's a few in there and he could probably talk about it. But you know, um that point hopefully is clear, all the things that contribute to making and building a character. And then they're put into an environment and you hope that the design and production team talk to each other and everything relates and it works well.
One of them that I think shows it, which we've discussed and shown in exhibition, is the Olivia de Havilland from the Eras. I mean,
Yeah.
and how the costumes change throughout the film. And it's something that maybe normal audiences don't normally think about. But when you start to look at it, you sort of realize that the style that the character is wearing at the very beginning is totally different as the character changes throughout the film. Now, it helps that it has a character that has very specific arcs in her development in the film, and they're very distant and different. So when she's a different character, her clothes do change. I mean, in the beginning, they're sort of, simple and perhaps a little bit overwhelming to this small little character, and she just looks like a doll that's wearing her mother's clothes or something like that. And as the film progresses, they change. They go through a bitter phase, and then they go through a phase where she's now a woman that is in charge of her own life. Uh, and those kind of things are the things that really excite me in films when the costume does play so much a big part of it. And so many actors have said, I didn't know yeah, I had done research and I knew the lines and all of this, but I never really knew who my character was until I put on the clothes. And then I knew who my character was. And if a costume designer is a good costume designer, that's what's going to happen.
Mm. Yeah. Larry, I know you love a good beaded gown. I want to talk about the Marlene Dietrich angel dress
Yeah.
because that's a great example of a piece that could, and I'm so glad has been restored because it went from being unshowable to something that you can now exhibit.
Yeah. I mean, and the thing about all the costumes is that, I mean, with some of these costumes, and even in sort of the Dietrich, I mean, they're approaching 100 years old.
Mm,
And they were held in an environment, the studio environment. I mean, a lot of the things were all hanging on wooden hangers, and they hung there for 40, 50 years. So
mm,
they weren't, and if they were, and they would use them and reuse them over and over and over again, uh, so they wouldn't have to pay the money. Usually it was a person in the background who was wearing it. Very seldom would they put a star in something another star had worn, even though that
mm,
did happen once in a while. But usually it was for the people in the background, so they didn't have to spend the money on the background, but they could keep that opulent look. So these things were worn over and over and over and over and over again. And the Dietrich gown was a piece that we saw. It was the first time we ever saw anything with their photos, and Diana Vreeland did an exhibition at the Met. And it was, I think that was for the first book that I had ever seen that actually had pictures of surviving Hollywood costumes. And so I was thrilled by the book. And that was photographed in the book. And so I always knew about it. And when it came up, Bill and I both wanted the piece, and it was in an auction from a Paramount auction that we had been hired to go back and research and set up. So we knew it was coming up, and we wanted it very badly. And it made that auction very difficult because there were hundreds of pieces that were absolutely incredible. But we wanted this piece, and we knew this piece was going to cost a lot of money. We knew it was going to cost a lot of money, and it ended up costing $20,000, which was a lot of money for us. In our research that we had done, we realized that it had been worn over and over and over and over again in multiple films, and they would cut the sleeves off of it, and they would cut the stole in half and wrap it around someone's head as a turban, and then put the sleeves back on and reconfigure the collar line. And so it had got, and this is a solidly beaded gown, which is not necessarily easy to do. But in all of this process, they would sometimes, when they would do bad restorations, they would take glue and they would like put it on the fabric and then just push the beads back together again. So there would be a huge clump of these beads held together. And sometimes they would use large paillettes, which are like gigantic sequins, to fill in the gaps of all the things that were missing. So when we got it, we realized there's no way this can ever be dressed on a mannequin because the weight of it, beaded gowns are usually beaded onto a chiffon backing. And so they take one of the heaviest, most rough items, which is bead sequins and rhinestones, and beat it on probably one of the most delicate, which is chiffon. And that was so that it wouldn't add bulk and everything like that. It would cling to the body and everything like that. But over a period of years, that chiffon starts to go. And we realized that this could never be worn again on a form because the chiffon wouldn't hold it. It would completely fall apart. So basically, we were left with a box of unshowable beads, an expensive box of unshowable beads. And so I contacted various different conservators and written people to see what to do. And some people said, leave it as it is, because that's the history of the piece. But the piece was so expensive and so important in film, especially for Marlene Dietrich, I wanted to have it restored. And luckily, I found the company who had the original beads and sequins because they had assisted in making the dress in the first place. And they had all of these beads, which is unusual that you're going to find a cachet of the same beads.
Yeah.
And so I started a project with them. It went on for 5 years. And I thought that thing, and it had to be done 4 inches at a time. And you would have to take out any bad areas that had been badly done, and you'd have to recreate them. We were very lucky because the dress is a series of paisley patterns that repeat themselves over and over again. So you could always take a pattern from this paisley pattern because it was the same paisley pattern as that one that was missing. And then you would completely reconstruct it with the beads, the pearls, the rhinestones, and they were small beads and so it took 5 years for this thing to happen. That is one of my, not that I have favorite pieces, but I do. And sometimes it's because of the journey it took either to get them or to take care of them.
Mm.
That piece is very special to me.
Speaking of journeys, sometimes you're able to gather pieces back together that were separated because
Uh-huh.
they were put into different areas of the costume
Mm-hmm.
shop. And I also appreciate when you're not able to do that because it either doesn't exist or
Yeah,
we don't know where it is, that
yeah,
you're able to then recreate pieces so that the designer's original vision, you can still share that in an
right.
exhibition.
The interesting thing about film costumes is a lot of times, especially on men's pieces or even sometimes on women's pieces, when they would go back into the storage room, they would oftentimes separate them, and the pants would go to the pants department, the coat would go to the coat department. So everything was split up, especially on the men, and that made it really difficult to put together a man's costume. It had to be pretty special to have stayed together or pure luck. Some of that we had some of that on we had some both of those, but on the women's pieces, a lot of times, uh, the bodice would go to the bodice and the skirt would go to the skirt. Sometimes they were one piece, which is why probably more women pieces exist than the men's pieces do. Uh, But when you're buying a piece, I mean, especially since our whole purpose was to show these pieces in exhibitions, I mean,
Yeah.
we wanted them to retain that same magic and to have that same effect of, oh, I remember that piece. So we tried to buy pieces that were as complete as possible. But there were times when you would buy a jacket. I remember we bought a jacket um, that was Clark Gable,
Mm.
and it ended up in, well, we had hoped was going to be Gone with the Wind. It wasn't Gone with the Wind. It ended up being Honky Tonk. But we had the jacket, and it was like, no, those pants have to be out there somewhere. I'm still waiting on those pants to come back. I have found vintage pants that match them, but they are not those pants. So I am waiting for those pants to show up. But you don't know, and so sometimes you never really know whether or not something's going to come back together again. There have been pieces like I have a costume of Mia Farrow from The Great Gatsby, and it's a beautiful traveling coat. It's a gray velvet, and then it has these black embroidered dragon motifs all over it. The coat can be shown by itself and it's still going to look good, but she was wearing a turban with the coat. And years later, that turban came up in an auction. And I thought, oh, I'll get it. It's a turban. Who's going to want a turban? Well, the turban ended up costing more than the dress did, but and which is usually the case when these pieces come up that you have to have because it finishes that costume and you have to have it. They always go for more than the original. I had a Madonna suit from Evita, and it was a simple, well, it's beautiful, but it's a simple 40 suit. Uh, but she's wearing this huge brooch with it, and I thought, well, I can always recreate that. But then I was searching, or maybe I could find something that was vintage that looked like that. I found the brooch, and it was an investment company in London that had bought a lot of the pieces from Madonna for investment reasons. I guess they were going to keep them and sit on them for a few years and then sell them at a profit. And they had the brooch. And so I contacted them and said, you wouldn't happen to like be interested in selling the brooch? And they said, oh, yeah. And they gave me this price. And it was like, okay, thank you very much. No, I can't do that. And they went, well, no, wait a minute. We can negotiate. And so we did negotiate. And I did pay, you know, a lot less than that, but almost as much as the suit itself. So
Mm.
sometimes when you reunite something, it gets very expensive.
Mm-hmm.
The Nina Foch costume too, from Ten Commandments, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And the necklace,
Yeah,
they were
they
really
can. A lot of pieces they come separately, and I don't know if it's a thing of willing things to come, or I think it's probably just pure luck or being at the right place at the right time. But a lot of pieces have come up, and that completes a piece or makes it certainly, even if it doesn't complete it, it certainly makes it better than it was and more dramatic than it was. So those excite me. They scare me, and they also excite me.
If each of you had to name the most historically or personally significant costume in the collection, what would it be?
Historically, or pieces that probably the public would most recognize, it would probably be the Marilyn Monroe from Some Like It Hot. It's not my favorite piece, but uh, I mean, I liked Marilyn Monroe, but she wasn't. Yeah, the only reason I got a Marilyn Monroe because if you were a serious collector, you needed to have a Marilyn Monroe, and it is a great Marilyn Monroe to have. But so that would be probably from the public's perspective, perhaps. But as far as my perspective, it would be the Greta Garbo Queen Christina gown because that's the piece that started the collection. That was the first piece we ever bought together, and it was the piece that started us on the journey of how and why we were going to have a collection and what we hoped it would do and the effect it would have.
and mine are totally different. I do think that the Dietrich is really historically significant because it was such a central feature in that 1974 Met exhibition, which is really the first major exhibition of Hollywood costume as artifacts in a museum. So it's like the first time really for the public that there was a mentality that those things were special. So that's that. But for me personally, I mean, I love that Liza Minnelli from New York, New York. I talk about it all the time, but that's just because it's a big show number and I love it. It's the one from for Natalie Wood from Gypsy because that costume is like a central image for the film and the promo of the film and like what's historically left um from the film visually. Like if you look up Gypsy, that a picture in that dress comes up. But also because I'm a burlesque costume historian. So if I had known Larry when I wrote the other book, I probably would have called
Yeah.
Larry about a photo of that costume in the book because I think
Yeah.
there's a picture of her in my other book because that
Oh,
film was
wow.
really significant.
Mm.
Um, so personally, for me, that ensemble is is one of the most important things.
Mm.
This goes back to a previous question, but that is also the costume that I think probably shows the manipulations
Mm.
that a
Right.
costume designer will
Yeah,
do to create a character. I mean, everybody says Natalie Wood created Daisy, but it was Ori Kelly who created Gypsy Rose Lee because Natalie Wood was what, 5'1", probably weighed 100 pounds at the most or whatever. She had no hips. This was the story of a famous burlesque performer, stripper, so she had to be voluptuous. The voluptuousness is built into that dress. I mean, the breasts are totally 100% padded out. I mean, that is totally fake. I mean, she had no hips, and so he would put embroidery on the hip area to make it look wider. And she was so short that they put these strings of beads down the front of the dress to create a longer look. And also, whenever she was on stage, and she was on the stage by herself and not with other women, they would shoot it from a lower level so that she would look taller. So costumes have a lot to do with creating a character and even creating a body that might not be there in the first place.
For each of you, do you have a memory of going into the theater, seeing a film that really resonated with you?
We weren't allowed to see films. So it was like I didn't see films until I probably got into high school or maybe even into college. I remember going and seeing Old Yeller. Then my parents took me and they said, well, because it's a story of a dog, how bad can that be? At the end of the movie, not to spoil it or any alert anything, but I mean they killed the dog. So I was in tears and I was screaming and yelling and crying, and they said, okay, we're not taking him to any more movies. So I probably didn't get to see a movie again until I saw The Sound of Music when I was in high school, and my sister was going on a date. My parents made her take me, and her and her boyfriend sat in the balcony, and I sat down below by myself. But that was probably the first time I had seen a film that I kind of really went, wow, wow, that's a cool world they're creating.
How about you, Colleen?
I mean, aside from animated films, which were the first things that I like fell in love with characters and their clothes, I think it's musicals. I think Annie was one of the earlier films that I remember seeing, but I think it was really Miss Hannigan's costume. There were feathers. It's really like if there was texture and there were these feathers and she could just wear a boa because she felt like it. That idea of the character wearing all the makeup and the extra jewelry and the necklaces, I think um that is an early memory of a character creation and me noticing the costume. But I think I didn't realize costume design was a job until one of the Tim Burton films, like an earlier Tim Burton film, maybe um, Edward Scissorhands or something, where I saw that the costume designer was Colleen Atwood, and I realized that like somebody named Colleen designed the costumes, and I thought, oh, someone named Colleen did the costumes. That means I could do costumes, and it really was a moment. It was a real moment in my life where I was like, someone named Colleen did it, so I could maybe do it. And it's a
Yeah.
thing that people do.
Yeah.
And then noticing the costumes in that because they're so amazing and the design in that is so amazing.
With behind-the-scenes insights, first-hand accounts, and critical research, McQueen and Scott illuminate a prominent cross-section of over 100 ensembles from the collection of motion picture costume design. It's a must-read and a must-see for everyone from costume designers to cinephiles, movie lovers to memorabilia collectors. Each page reveals a new visual treat accompanied by background on the actor, the film, the costume designer, and the provenance of each piece. My favorite part is hearing all the fascinating stories behind each of these screen treasures. It's a fascinating insight into how these pieces were made and continue to be preserved. That's our show. We hope you enjoyed the journey. If you like what we do, please consider becoming a member of Classic Movie Club. Your support helps us produce a new episode each month and continue the legacy of film review. Don't forget to subscribe, like, review, and share the podcast with all your film friends. My thanks again to Larry McQueen and Coleen Scott. You can find more details about their book, The Costumes of Hollywood, their companion podcast, and the collection of motion picture costume design in our show notes. We invite you back next month for another adventure, but until then, here's looking at you, kid.